any sort of industrial development at all. And one of the things I wanted to point out was, don't forget that the South had been utterly destroyed by the Civil War. So it was really, not only had it not had industry before the Civil War, but it really didn't have industry after the Civil War for quite a long time because of the physical destruction of the South. And so there was very little development. But slowly you're going to see the evolution. And I pointed out yesterday, it didn't help the South that Northern industrialists didn't want the South to industrialize as a form of competition, so particularly in the steel industry. But what begins to happen is some Northerners, particularly if you think about like New England, so you think about where Lowell was in Massachusetts, or some of these earlier factories that were great textile centers, they had become expensive from the perspective of the owners, and particularly because of the development of unions, organized labor, and also taxes were higher in the North. So they slowly started to invest capital to put the mills closer to the raw material. So if you think about where cotton is, it's in the South, why not have the textile mill there? So when we think about Dan River Mills, which I know for you guys, it's ancient history. You never experienced it as a functioning industry. And I did in its last decade, as an American growing up at the end of sort of the industrial era. Danville was one of the last communities to lose its key industry, which was in this case the Dan River Mills. What happened was, they recognized that they could employ people from all over the community. So if you think about it, at the peak of Dan River Mills' production, they had over 50,000 people working for them. So if you think about it, that's like the population of Danville now. And so these people are from North Carolina, from all the counties surrounding, and they would come and live here and work at the factory. So probably you have some grandparents or great grandparents that worked in the mill, or had family members that were mill workers, and their story is important and relevant to the development of Southern textile industry. So I have several lists in this chapter, and I think I don't have my guide with me here at home, but I think if memory serves, I need to amend it to have fewer numbers. But this is such a huge period in history, you can have so much takeaway. So if I were an AP student seeing a slide like this, I would be like, well, this looks like an essay quiz question or something, because there's so much going on as a result of just this period. So let's take a look at each one of these for a moment. First of all, number one, the critics of capitalism talk about the huge inequality between the richest and the poorest, and that's true. There is an absolute huge division, and that's number 6. If you look down there, accentuated, kind of it motivated a even bigger class division between the haves and the have-nots. But that being said, poor people in America live much better off than virtually poor people anywhere else. Now that may be like no real solace, but the standard of living for overall Americans is going to grow dramatically, and particularly for a new group of workers called the middle class. So this is a period in history where you start to see the folks who work not necessarily in the factory as like mill operators, like working a machine itself, but like the accountants and bookkeepers and lawyers and small businesses that sell to the employees. And so what you start to see is that it's kind of like a ripple effect that passes out from these factories that creates a middle class, teachers, and so that's a key development in American history. Of course, the factories are going to continue to be located in cities, so that means the cities are going to go bigger and bigger. Many of these will be new, rebuilt from old cities. So if you think about New York is always being torn down and then rebuilt. It's kind of like its history is that old buildings get demolished and they build new buildings. And of course, we've already mentioned Chicago. It had been devastated by the fire, and so they have a brand new city to basically build there. It's also the end of what I said was truly laissez-faire. And by that I mean you have both the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act, the Sherman Act, Antitrust Act, but you also have a sort of pro-business philosophy emerging government to sort of do whatever it can to help promote the success of business. So that's not laissez-faire, but it's not like corporatist yet either. So it's kind of and really it's the beginning of the idea that the government should have some say, but not a large scale. we talked about prior to the Industrial Revolution, particularly this phase of it, workers had been farmers, and their lives had been determined by, the seasons of the year, the schedule of the time, like how much sunlight they had, how much rainfall they had. Now it didn't matter. You had first, second, third shifts. Factories worked around the clock. Machinery never stopped running, and so that meant your life was now organized around your employer, right, rather than sort of nature. We're going to look at this lady number 5 here in a minute. The reality is women working in the workforce was very difficult. This was hard, brutal labor for women, children, men, everybody involved in the factory work. But nonetheless, we're going to look at this lady, and might as well do it now, because, hold on just a second. I left it lingering there on a Danville icon. Most young people aren't aware that here in Danville, we had someone who became sort of a style fashion role model for many, many women. Her name is Irene Langhorne, but she's known in history as the Gibson Girl, okay? And what you're looking at is a monument, a sign here in downtown Danville. This lady and her sister are two of the most interesting women of the late 19th, early 20th century. Both grew up in Danville. If you go to Danville and you're near the hospital, like at a corner of Main Street, you'll see these signs. And these two sisters, her sister, Nancy, married a nobleman in England, and she became a member of the House of Lords. Her name was Lady Astor, right? And so she was really successful. But this lady married an artist who was an artist for like cultural magazines, particularly, and his name was Charles Dana Gibson. And so she became his model for the sort of ideal woman of the late 19th century. So she became known as the Gibson Girl. So here, this lady is from Danville, and she, was known for her beauty, but also for her like athleticism and charm. So these are not big hoop skirts that these ladies are wearing anymore. That's kind of gone out of fashion. You can see here the swan corset, which emphasize a woman's figure. So the hair would usually be up. If you've seen the film Titanic, the way Rose is dressed in that movie, the main female lead, that's the Gibson Girl. This sort of iconic, youthful, athletic, smart. But I want to point that out. That wasn't typical. She was, like so many fashion, icons, not really what most people are like at all. So it's just interesting to me that one of the sort of greatest figures of fashion is right here from Dan. But I mentioned class division, the idea of the wealth, getting so much wealthier. And when they got wealthier, by the way, they built these sort of gated communities with walls and these massive estates, and they lived much like the second estate of the nobility in France. These huge, vast estates. The country, number 7. This is really important to me too, because when I think about education today, when you get schooling, it's like so I can get a good job, right? For a lot of people, and that's unfortunate, because it used to be your education wasn't really just to get employment, but our mindset has changed from creating wealth, from being our own boss, so to speak. Think about all these yeoman farmers for centuries, to becoming dependent on an employer. As if we're going to survive, we have to get paid by our employer, and that's really a whole philosophical shift in the history of our country. And then lastly, number 8, I think this is also really crucial, is that I mentioned that during this period, so during the 1870s, during the 1880s, we were the world's largest internal domestic self-sufficient market. But by the 1890s, these factories are putting out more stuff than Americans can consume. So they're producing so much that we as a nation, it's not that we can't afford to buy it, it's that we just don't need to buy it. Like there's too much stuff. And so that means these factory owners are going to start wanting to open up trade with foreign countries. And that means they're going to change their position. Interestingly enough, you're going to start to see a shift on how they view trade with other nations. It's going to come gradually at first, and then it's going to come full scale in an event called the Spanish-American War. So when we look at the Spanish-American War, keep in mind the context is the Industrial Revolution and the desire by these industrialists to sell their stuff in places like Asia, which, the Philippines were possessed by the Spanish. So that's an important key takeaway. So definitely know those. And I know your handout probably has more than 8, but I think your old book had a couple that kind of weren't, they were melded into this. So just focus on these 8, and I'll be just totally happy. I've got some images on the PowerPoint here for you just to process how very, very work intensive life was. So try to keep in mind what we think of as normal. Like I was saying about this today, I plan on start putting up a Hall of Fame, I think, on our hall, an academic wing, you might say, of all the great successful graduates that I've taught, at least, who are now, engineers and architects and medical doctors. So I think we don't focus on the fact that we are successful in that respect. We graduate really, really successful career professionals. Well, back then, that was just not very much an option for most people. Your life was 60 to 70 hours a week of work, and that's what your kids' lives would be expected to be. So you didn't really have like a dream of making it beyond that for most people. Very much like the rural poor today in America. So they had very hot, dirty, dangerous, like terrible working conditions, and you still had large numbers of child labor. You can see here, particularly in the South. You remember I mentioned that textiles were cheaper in the South? Well, one of the reasons is that Dan River Mills had kids working as labor, young people, and they made very little money, and it was very dangerous, and they usually got some sort of lung disease. But nonetheless, that was typical. Now, this didn't transfer very well, but it says the growth of the American labor movement. So when we talk about labor, we're talking about the workers who are, but the old term was blue collar, meaning that might be industrial factory workers, miners, things like that. And so if you look at the change in the labor force, right, you're going to see a growth in upper class occupations, right, from 8.7 to 12.8, right, and a growth in middle class, 3.3 from 2.4. So about 15%, and then you got the red there, so that's another 3 points. So about almost 20% of Americans were in this successfully well-off middle class or higher, right? Still had a large number of Americans in agriculture, but notice the declining numbers rapidly. You go from 1/3 of all Americans to 1/4 of all Americans, right? And that's noteworthy, particularly in your future essays. And then the enormity of the people working in factory or mining jobs. Half of the country were industrial workers, at least the majority. So when you think about, well, who is the government for? Is it for the 53%, or is it for the 28%? Or is it for the 100%? And that's really where the argument starts to shape during this period. Is like, we as factory workers, they would say, are not represented properly and not protected properly. So, and that's the key characteristic of the Industrial Revolution, is the shift away from agriculture. Now, today, this number would be ridiculously high. Today, it's 2 or less percent of Americans who make their livelihood from farming. All right, so 2%. And we're skewed here in rural Pennsylvania County. We have a lot of farming. So we're like, oh, farming's kind of normal. No, for most Americans, farming is not typical. But today, this number would also be very high. Most Americans are actually engaged in this stuff over here, the commerce and other, and not in this stuff either. But by the 20th century, the plurality of Americans will shift from agriculture into manufacturing, into working in industry and mining. So that's a major shift in the American workforce. As I said earlier, child labor was still a reality, particularly in textiles. But slowly you're going to see a development with the rise of expansion of public education, particularly in the South. You keep in mind that even the radical Reconstruction governments had created public education to the surprise of Southern whites. So that was going to start happening. But my granddaddy, for example, finished school in the 8th grade. That was as far as it went. And even for his age, that was not mandatory. The only kids that went to what was called high school were kids whose academic success indicated they were going to be college bound, so to speak. So they kind of like tracked either straight to the workforce when you were an 8th grader, or maybe you had a chance to make a career outside of that. And so these kids are 12, 10 years old. Here you see them being equated to slaves, galleys, and the Roman slave ships. But what I really want to point out is, while strikes were not like big strikes were not common, small scale labor unrest was very normal. So you're gonna have a handful of big strikes you have to know, and all 4 of them are identified here, or all, labor unrest, or all 5. Excuse me. I think it's 5 on this one. Yeah, you have the Great Railroad Strike. It is 4. I'm sorry, which we've already talked about. This is the one that's over cutting in wages, and Rutherford B. Hayes sends troops in to suppress the strike. This is all across the country that strike was. And then we're going to, I mentioned the Pullman strike and the Homestead strike, and we'll look at those again in during this period. So what I would ordinarily point out to students is that labor unions' first instinct is not to go on strike. Like, if you're familiar with what's been going on in Chicago and Illinois, the teachers have not wanted to go back to work, but they didn't want to go on strike because, if you go on strike, you don't get paid, and that means nobody's happy. So a strike is usually like the last straw. It's the most devastating kind of decision. But they are looking for ways to increase their success. Now, here's a union you've learned about before. It's a very early union in American history. It is not the first nationwide union. It was really in Appalachia, I think Western Pennsylvania and what is today West Virginia. They were called Molly Maguires, and they were Irish. They were Irish trade union who had come over. The Irish people came over, and they had already been organized somewhat in Ireland against their landlords and bosses. And so here in America, these were coal miners, and when they wouldn't get enough wages, they would actually use violence to, for example, they blew up the mines. They would actually put TNT, dynamite, in the mines and blow them up so that the mine owner couldn't get any money, and he maybe would negotiate. So they're what we would call a radical union, a violent union. Don't forget, this is the period that unions are on the rise in Europe too. All right, so, and they're very much hated by the industrial class. One of the ways that the industrial class in America was able to deal with unions is to sort of pay people to be violent against them. So, like, let's say that your union was going to have a protest, they would pay these guys to come in and break up the protest. Often they'd be armed. Usually they were the same age and the same, class as the factory workers. This was just a job for them. But for guys like Andrew Carnegie and others, these were the guys that would handle their dirty work. And they had gotten their start during the Civil War as George McClellan's sort of like intelligence agency, like his information gathering agency. But once the war ended, Pinkerton wanted to keep working. Obviously, he wanted to keep having success. So he basically had this as like a private army that you could hire as a corporation to handle the physical part of suppressing organized labor. So they were called the Pinkerton Agency. Okay, so I have this list, and again, I think I'm not exactly sure if it's 10 or 11 on your handout, but I think it's one or the other. But you definitely want to know how a corporation has inherent strengths against workers, i.e., organized labor. So the thing about what really creates a lot of unemployment is what is called mechanical unemployment. All right. And so, I remember President Trump, when he was a candidate, going to Appalachia and telling miners that he was going to bring back coal jobs. And I said, well, that's just ridiculous. That's not going to happen. Because here's the thing. Even if, President Trump had deregulated every bit of coal, the extraction of coal today is mechanized. Machines get the coal out of the ground, and not people like they used to. So just like in the automobile industry, like in the textile industry, when machinery is invented, you have unemployment. And of course, it's efficient. It creates more production with less costs. But people get angry about that. They lose their job to that, as you can imagine. And in your lifetime, you're going to see traditional labor being replaced, and it's really the pandemic has even sped that up, replacing humans, and so you're going to have this unemployment. And if people don't have these skills to do something else, then they're going to be out of work. Secondly, because of large-scale immigration during this period, the rise of Southern workers to a degree, the influx of African Americans for the first time into the workforce, you had lots of workers. So the factory owner can easily afford to fire an element of his workforce, particularly if they're unskilled, like they're easily replaceable. So back when I managed the front end of a food line, I used to joke with the baggers that, why they don't have a baggers union? It's because you guys, what you do is, almost a trained monkey could do. It's not that complicated. So I could easily replace a bagger with another bagger, so you're not going to form a union that anybody can do. Secondly, or thirdly, rather, corporations were extraordinarily wealthy. You had so much money, so they had the best lawyers. We've already talked about court cases that went their way. They owned the media, so people's newspapers they would read would be biased or loaded against the workers. And then they even controlled who got elected. So that meant, it was pretty hard to overcome all of that inertia. The word scab is not a pleasant word. I personally don't like that word. Now, I'm from a union family. My dad was in a union, but a scab is a pejorative, we would say, an ugly word for somebody who crosses a picket line. So let's say your union decides to go on strike, and then some people of that factory or that workforce don't go on strike. Like they try to go to the work, and that often resulted in violence. People would get really upset when people did that. Plus, I mentioned the Pinkertons would be very effective as sort of mercenaries using violence. Now, number 5 should be a new term to most of you. The court itself can issue an order stopping a strike. This is called an injunction, stopping an action. So if a strike or if a protest or a march was occurring and the corporate owner didn't like that, they're like, well, you don't want that, or it violated some law, they would file a petition with the local court or with the state court, and the court would then order the workers back to work or be incarcerated, jailed. Both Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, and Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, number 6 here, broke up strikes using the Army, using federal troops. So the military and the government was on the side again of the corporate. Number 7, this is something that most CEOs don't want to do, but if they feel like it's a gamble, so to speak, it's like a game of chicken. So let's say the workers are demanding a 5% increase in wages or an 8-hour workday, and you're like, well, you know what? The factory owner would say, I can afford not to produce anything for a month. Can you afford to not eat for a month? And he would literally lock his employees out, keep them from coming to work. It's like a owner strike. Like the owner would say, nope, you can't come in. Now, what was very common in that day, but they're now illegal, but you can't have these now. They've been outlawed since 1932, the Norris LaGuardia Act, but they were called yellow dog contracts. The phrase started around the early 1900s when workers were like, you're not even worth a yellow dog. Because what they are when you became an employee, you have to sign a promise not to join a union. They call these ironclad oaths. So you had to swear to not either create a union or join a union. Now, let's say you were a union organizer. Let's say you were a member of the AFL or the Wobbly, the IWW, and you were trying to agitate, create a union at a shop. Or keep in mind, let's say it's a group of workers. They may be immigrants like Polish or Italians, and there's no union in that plant or in that building, and so you go to it as a union representative, and you're trying to organize and say, look, let's form a union here. Well, your name might end up on a list that all the company owners would pass around, and you wouldn't get hired anywhere. And so that was called a blacklist. So they would threaten to blacklist you if you joined a union, or they would blacklist you. So that was very much a reality. So a lot of terms here. And then lastly, I have examples here, and Dan River was one of these, you know, a company town. Now, there were positive aspects of this that no longer exist, and then there were very negative aspects of this. So in the case of Dan River, they built a model town, which we call Schoolfield. Now, today, Schoolfield is still there, but the mill isn't. We'll have a casino there eventually. But this would be where the company owned the housing. The company owned the store. In Schoolfield, they owned the recreation center. They basically owned the church. They owned everything. The buildings, all of it was owned by the company. And now, not in Dan River, but in many places in West Virginia and Tennessee and around the country, they would pay you in what were called scrip, SCRIP, which is what this stuff is right here. This is company money. So in other words, you wouldn't even get paid in U.S. currency, which we've already talked about how that was a problem anyway. But you would be paid in scrip, which would only be used at the company store. So you couldn't even like take this and go somewhere else and spend it. So you're being paid with like company money that you had to use at the company store, which of course they set the prices for everything. In many mining towns, you had to rent everything from the tools to the safety equipment to the bed that you slept in, your house. So it was virtually impossible. How do you have any leverage against that? So if you think about today's world, about organized labor, some of the most notable places for successful organized labor is like professional athletes. You know, professional athletes' skills are so unique and so specialized, they can actually leverage their employers and say, look, you guys wouldn't make all the millions of dollars you get without us. But for most Americans who are working in jobs that are not that skilled, semi-skilled or unskilled, you can't do this. I mean, what are you going to be, a union at Starbucks? You know, so this is why. And then, of course, the other major issue today is that America is much more in professions, and professions don't tend to unionize that much unless they're in the government sector. So, you know, really hard to form a union. But eventually, unions are going to slowly start being formed. Now, before the Knights of Labor emerges, there was a fairly you know, broad organized labor union called the National Labor Union. So before the KOL was a union called the National Labor Union. It had some success, but unfortunately for it, because it included, and this is going to be the Knights of Labor problem too, it includes both skilled and unskilled workers. And so when you have so many unskilled workers in an organization, you lose some of your strength, okay? And I say that simply from a position of, it's hard to leverage an employer to, you know, to pressure an employer if they can replace you easily. You know, and that's one of the reasons why the law of supply and demand. So like take where I work here in Pennsylvania County, teachers aren't in unions. Now they're in a professional association, but it's not a union, meaning it doesn't have any what's called collective bargaining. So without that collective bargaining, without the power to negotiate, it's very hard to get any leverage, even in a fairly high skilled profession. So the National Labor Union is going to fade away after the Civil War, and what's going to become sort of the most first really broad union is this thing called the KOL, or Knights of Labor. And it's founded by a Mason named Terrence Powderly. You can even see like Masonic symbols in it. And they were a sort of socialist, like we would call it today, democratic socialist, in a sense that they were very broad organized and they had lots of goals. And the problem, I think, for the Knights of Labor is, again, this inclusion of basically all workers. And that includes women, and that includes minorities. And so the Knights of Labor was, and nothing wrong with those attitudes. But, you know, when I talked about it being sort of socialistic, I didn't mean like Marxist. So if you look right here, like worker-owned factories, this is a common goal, even dating back to the first Industrial Revolution. It's like, what's the best way to ensure equal pay for equal work is to have the workers own the factories. So there would be no like CEO or owner per se. But what's really notable for me, keep in mind, both the workers' co-ops and worker-owned factories do exist today on small scale. You know, like there are worker co-ops and bakeries and things like that. But this will be not successful, the number 2 and 3. But the idea of an 8-hour workday is going to become normalized because of the Knights of Labor. Okay, well, you know, like the normal 8-hour workday plus overtime. There's no such thing as overtime in the 19th century. They're going to get rid of child labor, or want to, and ultimately will. You'll notice an interest in supporting the farmers with greenbacks. Okay, so you're seeing here, I hope, that the Knights of Labor and the farmers of the populist movement have many similar goals. And so that could create a very powerful coalition of the nation's factory workers and farmers. Now, I hope I don't have to remind you that the symbol of the Soviet Union is the hammer and the sickle, right? That's the factory worker and the farmer. So while these aren't communists, this is the kind of American worker agitating for the workforce of ordinary Americans, so to speak. They wanted equal pay, which of course we still don't formally have in America. Safety codes, that's a radical new idea, right? Stop bringing in foreign labor. So both the populace and the KOL were not fans of new immigrants, and getting rid of the national bank. So somewhat socialistic, not on any scale like a Marxist group, but particularly the cooperative element, and very popular. And it looked like this group might have some success, but the Great Railroad Strike was a setback. You may recall it came during the Panic of 1873, which was really the Long Depression, right? So when they went on strike during the Depression, there was not much sympathy for them. You know, people were like, we're all hurting, you know, and plus, if you look at where all the strikes were, that, you know, this really crippled railroad traffic for, you know, a few months back and forth. And what happened is when Hayes sent in the army, Hayes had support for that, you know, and here it is. That was the end of that. But that was not the end of the Knights of Labor. So here's a comparison from that magazine Puck, which I was telling you about. Over here, you have the enormous strength of the industrialists. You know, here you have the train and kind of like massive armor and all the CEOs over here. And then you have the little worker with his little hammer, and he's riding on a very flimsy donkey. So you could probably do the math on what that represents. Okay. So what happened was the Knights of Labor were routinely associated with strikes. This was a meeting over a strike that was, you may have recall Cyrus McCormick, the McCormick Harvester. This was going to be, it's in Chicago, this mass meeting as a result of the McCormick factory's poor working conditions and pay. So Haymarket Square is in Chicago, right? Unfortunately for the Knights of Labor, inside the protest, and this is something that's been happening, you know, in our country now, were a group that joined sort of with the protesters who were anarchists. So they were looking for a place to attack cops. They were looking for a place to do violence. Now, that was not the intent of the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor didn't get together to attack cops, but amidst this protest, you had terrible violence to break out in Chicago at Haymarket. And when it happened, people died. And so the strikers, the Knights of Labor protesters, were blamed for the violence. It was, you know, like you may have seen this summer at some of the protests this past summer, where you had peaceful protesters and all of a sudden there was violence. And you're like, what the heck happened? Well, what happens is there are people who like to use the cover of a mass event to do destruction, you know, to do damage. And these were actually philosophically inclined anarchists. These were people who really wanted to tear down the government of the United States. An anarchist is going to kill President McKinley, right? So, you know, this is a period where anarchism is actually a very popular mindset imported from Europe. And unfortunately for the Knights of Labor, that's what they get associated with. Like, they are going to be now seen as violent anarchists. And so as a result, the Knights of Labor, plus they like I said, they made some organizing errors of, if you have this huge union, then you are going to lose a lot of battles because of the list I gave you, that 10 list. So here you see the Haymarket policemen who were killed, which was, you know, like I said, it was tragic. These were policemen who were sent in to try to, you know, stop the rioting, so to speak. Although it's a debate about did the police engage and begin the rioting. I think the anarchists certainly were responsible for the violence. But once this thing gets going, you know, lots of violence occurs. And what's interesting is later on, the Democratic governor of Illinois is going to pardon the people who were convicted for crimes at the Haymarket riot. Okay, he's going to pardon them, and here you can see, you know, him being blunt. This is what was called Judge magazine, another one of those really cool magazines. But here he's unleashing the dogs, the mad dogs, you know, of anarchism by letting out the Haymarket protesters. So obviously a hotly debated topic, but regardless, the Haymarket Square riot is what really brings an end to the Knights of Labor, as well as the Long Depression. You know, I mean, all of this occurred in the wake of a period where people were trying to recover, and so they're like not sympathetic, at least some people. So what I want to close you with here is the most successful union of the period, the one that still exists today. Like this union is still in America, and it is called the American Federation of Labor. So I want to emphasize the name of it first of all. The AFL, which is later going to become the AFL-CIO. AFL is actually a union of unions. So if you know Goodyear workers who are in the union, United Rubber Workers or United Steel Workers, both URW and USW are part of the AFL. They're union of unions, right? And the difference between the AFL and the Knights of Labor and the National Labor Union is they will only incorporate skilled trade unions. So Gompers, he was a cigar maker and a very, very skilled organizer. He is going to say, we're not radical socialists. That's the first thing he emphasizes. We're not socialists. We're not radicals. And people would say, well, what is it that you want? He said, all I've ever wanted for my people is more, and so he views himself as operating within the parameters of a capitalist America, and he's just fighting for his slice of the pie, his being his workers. So these are not socialists, and they're not, unskilled labor. These are much more skilled employees, and so they're going to have quite a bit of success. Plus, I'd point out that during during wartime, this union will be consistently pro-America, supportive of the war, not go on strike. So the AFL is going to last and still exist. Now, unions today way down in population and numbers, but that's because I think really a lot of factors, and we'll look at the decline in unionism in the mid 20th century, the 1960s. But this is really not the peak of it. It'll peak in the period right around World War II and immediately after, and then start to decline by the 50s. So I've read you this quote already, and Gompers was a gifted speaker. He is arguing that, and this has been the union argument all along, and really it's the argument for the people who want to raise the minimum wage too. If you raise poor people's wages, they're going to spend every dime of it. They're going to go out and spend it, which means they're going to create more production, which means if you pay your workers, they're going to consume your stuff, right? But if you don't pay your workers, then you're going to have to sell your stuff somewhere else. And all because you want an extra penny or two. That's what he's going to argue. And that's a fairly consistent argument that skilled union organizers are going to say. Is like, look, we're not asking for, unrealistic wages. We're asking to be paid fairly so that we can buy stuff that we're making. Which is fascinating. I remember being in Honduras where they have sweatshops, and went by one and saw it. The average Honduran at the time made $300 a year. Okay, $300 US dollars, and a Coca-Cola in Honduras cost $1, which means you were never going to get a Coca-Cola, because that was like a day's wages, basically. So the idea is you want to be able to purchase the work that you produce, and it's a really fascinating argument. So here's the AFL's success, okay? And I definitely want you to come away with understanding how this is really the reason why the AFL was so long-term successful. So first of all, they really focus solely on the skilled worker. Like I said, only workers who weren't easily replaced. So if you think about a Goodyear worker, these guys and ladies are highly trained. They're very skilled at the thing they do, and it takes months, if not longer, to replace them and retrain and go through all that process. So important that be recognized. Second, this was the first major union to engage in lobbying. So I didn't type that there, and I can't write at this point, but put beside this LOBBYING, lobbying, because that's when someone from the union starts arguing before congressmen or trying to convince congressmen of, look, I represent 30,000 people who vote, and they can influence, whether or not you get reelected, or we can raise money and support your opponent. And so that's going to become how unions are going to become active in politics. They're going to take the union's fund, this large amount of money, and start paying for professional lobbyists and paying for, really just people who will try to counteract the strength of the corporation. They had a national strike fund, which meant if you went on strike, you would receive money that you had paid for with union dues to carry your family through the strike, which meant you could last much longer. And again, Gompers was not a fan of the strike. He didn't want to do that because he recognized, as soon as you stop working, you can be seen as the villain, right? but he tried to promote the idea that unions were American, that unions were democratic, that unions were, workforce, the people of America, and not not the elites of America, so to speak. And by having a federation, it meant that they could work out how much they accepted. For example, if you had set rates for how much you charged, rather than have rate wars between workers, you could have them agree, kind of like not monopoly, but they were accused of that, to work together to set your rates. Now, this other term I want you to still be familiar with, even to the present. It's definitely relevant. I told you that here in Virginia, teachers do not have this power, the negotiating power. It's called collective bargaining. It just means like the union would sit down with management, ownership, and often have a mediator, and they'd say, okay, we want a 15% raise and better working conditions and an 8-hour workday. And they'd come back and say, well, we're not going to budge on the 8-hour workday, but we can give you an 8% raise. So it's a negotiation, and it puts a voice for all the thousands of workers. All right. And then lastly, down here, they pushed for and got in many places in America, particularly in the Rust Belt, we call it now, but in the industrial Midwest. So you think about Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, what are called closed shops. So a closed shop means when that business hires someone, okay, as a condition for employment, they must join the union. So it means all the employees in that business are unionized in that particular location. So in Virginia, that is not legal. We don't have closed shops. Virginia's called a right to work state, which means no employer can make a contract with the union to only require union labor. But the idea was, and it wasn't like they were hiding this from people, if you applied for a job at wherever, you knew that as a condition for your employment that you would be a union worker. You would be part of the union. Well, that's going to be popular in the part of our country that is most industrialized, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. And then in the recent last 20 years, you've seen a steady end to the closed shop. So a lot of states in the industrial Midwest, which are losing their industries, are saying we can't be pushed around by unions. We need workers, so to speak. So the closed shop was something they wanted. But I point this out. I don't think unions are going to cut deeply into the profits of corporations during the 19th century. They're not going to. There's a lot of discussion about the average American worker and unions being greedy or whatever. And I think, well, I get that, but at the same time, if you have a healthy, vibrant middle class, then you don't have violence and rioting, and people can afford to have a better quality of living and standard of living. So this is a fascinating development in American history that will see its peak in the 1950s, where 60% of the Americans are in the middle class, like a huge success. But nonetheless, these are the incidents that I mentioned earlier, the Homestead strike. During Homestead, by the way, Carnegie goes to Scotland. He just leaves. And this is before U.S. Steel is formed. And he leaves it in charge of his sort of henchman, his key underling, Henry Frick, and a member of the anarchist movement named Alexander Berkman tries to assassinate him. So that gets associated. And then you have this other big work stoppage under Eugene Debs in the Pullman town. And so Pullman, if you remember, is where they made the Pullman cars, these new developments in train travel. And the porters, the workers in the trains go on strike. And that means the trains stop running. And so Cleveland is going to send in troops. And so, if I have to use the entire army to deliver a postcard, then so be it. So this will be crushed by the courts and by President Cleveland. So 19th century, not really the heyday of unionism, but an attempt by workers to counteract the enormity of the wealth of power of corporations. And, I'll stop with that and see if you guys have any questions I need to elaborate.